Hello again, it's your old friend Theta, the monotone messiah. Today we're going to talk about a subject that needs to be talked about: mistakes. This video has been a long time coming, but after a near loss in our last match, I felt this was the moment to make it happen. We almost lost, not only because our opponents played well, but because we made some critical errors. Seeing people's reactions after the fact also made me think this video needed to be made, as there are many misconceptions about what it's like to play in the top rungs of the competitive ladder. This isn't anyone's fault. It's just one of those situations where you won't really get it until you reach that point yourself. My hope is that you'll recognize the dynamics I'm about to explain without having to go through the painful learning experiences, but I suspect that's not likely to happen. I will give it a shot anyway. People tend to think that what separates the winners and the losers in games is high quality play. That's why there's an extreme focus on what could be called the positive or technique levels of the game. What's considered good play in specific situations. If you're in situation A, you take action B, and that is what's viewed as quote-unquote correct play. I'm not here to tell you that this way of seeing things is wrong. You do need to have a solid technical foundation if you want to get anywhere in a competitive game, and that's an unavoidable truth. The bottom rungs of the ladder will always be filled with players and teams who are easy to exploit because they're still a novice at this technical level. Who wins and who loses tends to come down to who is more technically skilled. The skill gap between a brand new player or a team in their first game against another novice in their 10th game is bound to be gigantic, which is why you are more likely to see a big score differential at these lower levels. But as you move up the ladder, the situation begins to change. After a certain point, everyone you face will be technically competent. There are still bound to be some skill gaps, but they tend to be small and specialized. Teams and players at the higher levels are good in most situations and only very good or bad in a small, specific subset of scenarios. What we can draw from this is that as you face better and better opponents, the game becomes much less about having a skill advantage over them. It transforms into a game of mistakes. Who makes them and who forces their opponents to make them. There's a famous quote by Sakata Eo, a legendary player of Go, that I like to keep in mind when I'm thinking about this subject, and I recommend you take it to heart as well. Go is not about winning through brilliant moves. It is about losing through bad moves. In other words, winning is not about making the flashy, high-profile move that everyone finds entertaining. Coming out on top is about avoiding mistakes that will cost you the match. You can replace the word go with the name of just about any game with real strategic depth. When you're playing against good opponents, the game boils down to figuring out which situations they're weak in and forcing them into those situations. Because if you try to face them where they're strong, they're often going to be competent enough to leverage that into a win. The overall game turns into a dance, where both sides are playing to the best of their abilities and taking small risks to probe for weaknesses. The probing itself might end up costing too much, and sometimes the probing reveals something about one side that opens the floodgates for a victory. This is the back and forth you should expect when skilled players face each other. Much like how the initial stages of a boxing match tend to be a slow, deliberate feeling out process. It's only later in the match, when patterns of weakness have been identified, that knockout blows are attempted. Now that we have a general, somewhat philosophical perspective on this subject, I want you to internalize a taxonomy of mistakes that can be made before, during, and after a match. Mistakes can be classified into 4 different categories, each affecting a different level of the game, although in many cases they seep into multiple levels. These 4 categories are meta mistakes, strategic mistakes, tactical mistakes, and mental mistakes. Meta mistakes are errors made outside of the game itself, but which impact your performance in a negative way regardless. The prime example is sleep deprivation. Even though sleep is never connected to the game itself, not sleeping enough is an objectively bad idea if you want to think and perform at a high level. Another meta mistake is not studying footage and assuming you will win based on your current state of knowledge and skill. Meta mistakes can be catastrophic, but they're also the hardest to identify and fix. You might not be sleeping enough and not realize that you play much better with a full 8 hours of sleep under your belt. Perhaps you've gotten away with not studying film for your whole career, and then you lose because you didn't exploit a pattern you could have easily spotted had you taken the time to study. You can also make meta mistakes after the match is over. Anytime you make mistakes and don't correct them, you're making a meta mistake, so it follows that continuing to go down the same pathways that generate losses is itself a meta mistake. It's worth mentioning here that the ultimate meta mistake, what you might call a meta mistake, is to make any kind of mistake and believe it wasn't a mistake. This can happen because you're too inexperienced to recognize it as such, or because your ego is too big. But in my mind, the absolute worst meta mistakes come from situations where you made the mistake and still prevailed. It takes a strong mind to recognize that you won in spite of your mistakes and work to correct your play so that they don't happen in the future. The next type of mistakes are strategic mistakes. These are the errors you make around your general strategy for dealing with a given opponent. You might conclude that they'll play fast and loose, set up all your strategizing around that assumption, and then find them playing slowly and carefully on the day of the match. Making strategic mistakes is a big deal because it means your overall ability to anticipate what your opponents will do in a given match is off somehow. Sometimes an opponent will deliberately alter their playstyle to throw you off, but in most cases people will fall back to the patterns they're comfortable with. If you struggle to find those patterns, even in the face of deceptive plays designed to disguise them, chances are good that you're making strategic mistakes. Tactical mistakes are what could be considered execution mistakes. You might have a good strategy for dealing with an opponent, but that doesn't mean you can implement it. If your technique gets sloppy, then a good strategy doesn't mean much. This comes up in reference to my team Mayhem all the time. People always say we play the exact same way every match, which isn't 100% true by the way, and yet we've still managed to make it to number 2 worldwide. Whenever I get asked about this dynamic, my reply is always the same. It's one thing to know what's coming, it's another to stop it. Although tactical mistakes are important, they are often the easiest to correct. If your meta and strategic thinking are fine but you're making tactical mistakes, it's much easier to watch footage and identify those mistakes. Once you've ID'd them, you can work on fixing them in practice. For example, if you keep dying because you're hanging out in a spot with too much angle exposure, then that's easy to correct. You just find a new spot. Fixing tactical mistakes tends to come down to awareness and practice. If you stay focused on getting better, you'll see your tactical mistakes, and then it's up to you to take the time to correct those mistakes. Finally, there are mental mistakes. My video on Tilt covers the negative side of this in detail, but the general idea behind mental mistakes is that you aren't keeping a lid on your own psychology. If you find yourself getting consumed by emotion, either negative or positive, you're making a mental mistake of one kind or another. The most common mental mistakes involve negative emotions like the aforementioned tilt. Everyone gets frustrated sometimes, but letting that boil over into anger at the game, your team, your opponents, or any other element in your environment is objectively a mistake. But what gets overlooked far more often are the downsides of unrestrained positive emotions. There's a military term I've talked about before called victory disease that describes a situation where you loosen up right before the moment where you really, truly win. Then, before you know it, your victory evaporates as the other side takes advantage of your slack to mount a comeback. This happens all the time in all sorts of competitive games. Just think of any situation where someone starts celebrating before the clock hits 0 and the game is completely won. This kind of mistake is one of those pervasive, hard to identify problems that can harm you a ton if you don't address it. For example, maybe you've gotten away with celebrating or playing fast and loose right before the buzzer in most of your previous wins. All it takes is one time against a motivated opponent for you to pay for that mistake dearly. Another related mental mistake is getting too conservative when you're on the brink of victory. If you believe you're going to win, you should play more carefully and focus on making plays that will guarantee you the win. But if you decide to take 0 risks leading up to that point, that is an exploitable pattern and an intensely motivated opponent will take advantage if you aren't careful. You can think of this as playing not to lose instead of playing to win. I'll take it a step further and say it's not just about external manifestations of those emotions either. If you're keeping a calm demeanor but are internally fuming, you're still technically tilted. What's more important is addressing your internal state, which will in turn influence how you express yourself to the outside world. Try to recognize this if it's happening to you or a teammate. It's human to have emotions, and there are a variety of ways to express those emotions outside of the game. But while you're still in the game, you need to find a way to calm yourself. What's challenging about internalizing all of this is that feedback gets harder and harder to process and decipher as you continue to climb the ranks. Again, after a certain level, everyone is good, and tactical mistakes, which are the easiest to spot, rarely end up being the pure deciding factor. When they are, it's usually a one-off specific situation that may or may not be replicated in the future. Furthermore, quality competitors are aware of the need to conceal their weaknesses. This translates into a multi-level game of deception where teams will purposefully give signals about their preferences in the name of misleading current or future opponents. Breaking down good opponents at a strategic level becomes particularly challenging because good players are adaptable. They may be able to identify their own weaknesses from a previous match and work to fix their leaks, which means your strategy will itself have leaks if you're expecting them to make those mistakes. I would argue that the mistakes which make or break a high-level player or team are often either meta mistakes or mental mistakes. A good team that's filled with players who don't sleep enough can fall apart at a critical juncture where discipline and precision are required. Likewise, players who are equally matched on paper can create lopsided outcomes if one side starts to make mental mistakes like succumbing to victory disease at the decisive moment of the game. Just speaking as someone who is now playing at the top of the ladder within a game, I'm starting to see this more and more. None of the games I'm involved in are easy, and most of the time the people I'm playing against are just as good, if not better than me. But the scales tip towards whoever can keep their composure and not make critical mistakes. Whoever fails to do either of those things will lose more often than not. People fantasize about being at the top, thinking that their competitive life will somehow get easier. The reality is you have to work even harder to stay there because everyone is gunning for you, studying your footage, and working to exploit any and all weaknesses in your game. This all flows into a concept I like to call mistake cascades. This is when one mistake creates a feedback loop of errors, causing a player or team to fall apart as a result. They often start at one level and leak out into others. For example, if you make the meta mistake of not sleeping enough, this can create tactical mistakes because your decision-making abilities are impaired. Or you can make a strategic mistake when analyzing an opponent, which in turn generates tactical mistakes because your entire conception of the other side is wrong. Mental mistakes tend to have the biggest impact in cascades. You get tilted one way or another, and that creates strategic errors, which in turn build into tactical errors, finally terminating with the meta mistake of believing that you didn't make mistakes at all, and that maybe some other external factor like the game or some kind of hacks were at fault. These are the dynamics you must avoid at all costs if you're going to survive the trip to the top of your competitive world. One final idea I want you to internalize is what I call blaming the kicker. Basically, blaming the kicker is when you think the outcome of a match comes down to the single most visible moment. I call it blaming the kicker because this happens all the time in American football when a kicker misses a field goal on the final play and his team's fate is sealed as a result. The ball doesn't go through the uprights, and the next day there are headlines all over about how the kicker blew it for the rest of the team. This is a natural tendency, as we all like to place attention on what's easiest to focus on. It's cognitively taxing to think in detail, so we latch on to what's most obvious. But doing that hides a more complex, difficult to understand truth. For example, American football games are played over the course of 4 15-minute quarters. There are ample opportunities for both sides to make plays and create a significant score gap. By allowing the game to come down to a single moment, where the kicker will take on the responsibility of saving the whole match for his team, the team has, by default, missed many opportunities and made many mistakes. You can then conclude that it's never really the kicker's fault. It's the whole team's fault for putting themselves in a position to rely so much on the kicker. If they performed better and not made as many mistakes, then they wouldn't have had to lean on the kicker at all. There might have been decisive moments that shifted the course of the game, but they aren't given the kind of visibility that a missed kick gets. I'll use an example from Onward to illustrate this point a little further. In our Season 10 matchup against Animal House, we were on a 3-3 round where losing would have taken us to a tie-breaking third map, and winning would have given us the match. At the end of the round, with time winding down, Wookiee and Nix Dragon traded, and we won. A lot of people said afterwards that it all came down to that one moment. It really didn't though. We had already played a map before this and won. And we made a bunch of mistakes leading up to that moment, including a team kill on our side. Before this round, we had Animal House at 3-1 and could have closed it out early if we'd not made a bunch of stupid mistakes in the face of Animal House's suddenly very good play. So while it's easiest to say the match was decided by this final, highly visible moment, it wasn't. If Animal House had won the first map, or we had made even more mistakes in the second map, they could have won. But it's harder to think about that collection of more mundane moments than it is to focus on one intense moment. In other words, it's always easier to blame the kicker. This is a big subject, and I could talk about it for quite a bit longer, but I think this is enough for you to ponder for now. Next time you lose a match or come close to losing, think about this framework I've laid out. What kind of mistakes did you make? Did you allow those mistakes to cascade into a waterfall of errors? Are you blaming the kicker instead of breaking down the larger picture? If you ask yourself these questions on a regular basis, you'll find it easier to tighten up your game and rise up the ranks. Just remember, the higher you go, the more important this style of thinking becomes. And with that, it's time to say goodbye. This is Theta, signing off.